So, Craig, you're very welcome as an avatar to our first Innovation Union convention here in Brussels. We're delighted to see you here, and we'd like to invite you in as an avatar. I have to say I'm very nervous about this. I haven't done this before, and we're always, as Don Tapscott told us a couple of minutes ago, frightened of what we don't know and frightened of technology. So welcome, Craig.
Thanks, Máire. It's good to be here, even as an avatar.
Well, we're always in Europe willing to try new things, Craig, and we've been listening very carefully here in the auditorium to you and what you said about Innovation Union. But now that we can chat together, can I ask you, have you any extra thoughts on innovation in Europe? What do you think works well, and where do you think we need to have a game changer?
Well, one of the reasons I suggested that we try this avatar discussion was it's something that the kids are growing up with now. You know, we introduced it this year, and essentially young children and teenagers are using this to communicate and collaborate for social purposes. But I wanted to, in a way, highlight the importance of getting young people engaged in these scientifically interesting things earlier. I know a lot of the conversations, which I had a chance to review over the last day and a half, have focused on the universities and the businesses and institutes. But I think it's going to be very important to have the feedstock of very bright, well-trained young people. And I think we have to think out of the box and recognize that they're growing up in a different environment, and we need to find a way to bring them into the innovation process earlier.
Well, one of the discussions that has gone on at a number of the sessions here over the last 2 days relates to this very topic, STEM education. How do we get young people interested in STEM education when a lot of young people feel that science, technology, engineering and math are very difficult subjects, difficult to get good marks in? What do you think we should be doing to encourage more young people into this area of education?
I think there's three things that are important. One, we've developed a media culture that tends to celebrate athletes and entertainers more than they celebrate the science community. And I think it's important to be able to expose kids to the feats that are accomplished and produce the life that they live in by other people. I think that the teachers also have to become more comfortable. Even as you said, you're a little nervous sitting down and having your first avatar-based interaction. But in a sense, teachers face a similar challenge every day. They encounter children that are incredibly adept at using these technologies. Recently, we did a report for President Obama, and one of the things we recommended to him was that we have to develop a way of getting the teachers to be more acclimated to these kind of capabilities. And I think that things like that are going to be important, as well as just exposure to the technologies.
I like the whole idea that Robert Jan Smits talked about in his introduction about us being, avatars of old were gods. And I think when I go back to the Commission and to the Directorate General for Research and Innovation, I'll start behaving in a way like a deity of old. But if we come to modern life now and talk about innovation and how we can do exactly what you talked about, thinking outside of the box, finding solutions to global societal challenges. This is something that Microsoft and many other companies have really been in the lead in finding solutions to these kind of issues. I need to explain to ministers and to people like Professor Royal, who's here with us this evening from the European Parliament, that we can do this and we should invest money in this area and that it's money well spent. Can you support that theory for me so it makes it easier to explain to the ministers?
I think that's absolutely true. There's no way that we're going to be able to solve these big problems without a big investment in basic science. I think many people have argued, even in the conference, that we're nearing a point where many of the basic investments that were made sort of in the post-war decades have served us well, but to some extent much of that has been realized. And over the last few decades in Europe and the United States, government has shifted away from a lot of the basic science to more applied. At the same time, we have seen in the U.S., for example, that businesses and venture capital are really good at harvesting. And so I think it's going to be essential that the government recognize and support its role in getting this basic science work done. And without that, we're going to cut ourselves off from the fundamental advances that are necessary to create not only solutions to these giant problems, but are going to be the bread and butter solutions to the things that will create jobs and drive the economy forward in the decades ahead.
Talking about creating jobs and driving the economy forward in the decade ahead, of course, the biggest challenge for a politician, a minister in any member state virtually in Europe at the moment is they're all dealing with austerity, they're putting in place difficult budgets, they're trying to decide where to cut and where to invest. And obviously we're trying really, really strongly to insist that they invest and help them to invest in research and innovation. But as you know, a politician or a minister wants to be able to deliver jobs next week, next month, next year. Investment in research and innovation doesn't do that. So, give us an explanation, if you like, that we can use with the ministers and the governments that really focuses their attention on the fact that research and innovation investment is an essential, is a necessity, will create the growth and the competitiveness that we need in Europe's economy.
I think that one of the essential elements of understanding how to deal with this is to separate the research part from the development part. Almost everybody talks about R&D like it was one thing, but in fact it's two things. One has a very basic role to play. It's a foundational capability, and you have to be willing to make risk-based investments in that. The other is essentially the harvesting and the creation of these things are the products that everybody uses every day. And I think that one of the challenges that governments face, particularly in austere times, is that they don't have a good intuition about what's R, and which I think is perhaps their most primal role, and what's D, where there are many other components that can contribute. The private sector, businesses, venture capital, all of these are supplemental in that domain. And so I think, particularly when you have to focus on these things, the government can spend less money, I think, on the developmental part, as long as what they do is to create the right environment for these other factors to be able to flourish. Having the right infrastructure in place, making sure you're supporting the education system, including at the STEM education level, having favorable environments for investment. At the end of the day, the business community globally is going to invest a lot more to make the products that create the jobs than the governments ever will. And so it's all about leverage in my mind. And if you, in a sense, subtract a little bit away from the short term and put more of the government's money on the long term, and then make sure that the role of government is discharged properly with respect to creating these favorable conditions, then I think you get the best of both worlds. My great fear is that, if people confuse government investment with the immediate creation of jobs, what you get is sort of an unsustainable stimulus model of how this is working. And, we, in a sense, can see in Europe and elsewhere that, we're really can't afford that any longer. And so I think it's sort of a question of back to fundamentals, and fundamentals mean long-term science investments. That's got to be supported by the government. Getting kids and others involved in that environment, and then creating a favorable climate for business and private investment to solve the current day problem.
So finally, Craig, and obviously we very much appreciate you taking the time to talk to us at the conference today and be present and give of your time, which is very precious, I know. If I were to say, or to ask you, when Microsoft sits down to decide where to invest in the world, whether it's an R&D facility or not, what are the elements present in a location that would really encourage Microsoft to come and invest in that location?
if you look at how the company has evolved, I think the first thing that has guided us always is availability of talent. You know, Microsoft is almost a pure intellectual property business. And as a result, you know, the only input to our factory is smart people, and the only output is their ideas encapsulated in technology. And so we have a much more pure assessment than other people might, because we don't build giant factories, we don't have some of the traditional kinds of incentives that other companies might look for. So for us, it's first and foremost the people. You know, in our research activities, you know, the thing that has always guided us is the quality of the elite research universities. You know, we see the collaboration with them as essential. Interestingly, for example, in our pure research activity, we have as many interns and visiting scholars every year as we do employees. And so, you know, the proximity of these students and the ability to collaborate with them in the academic environment is an essential part of how we do our research. On the development side, you know, we're invested in many places in Europe, some through acquisition, some through organic growth of our own. But again, the key is the right business climate in which to operate these businesses, and in particular to be able to have and hold great people. And so I think in the end, much like venture capitalists, many people think venture capitalists invest in projects. My own experience, having been the recipient of that, is that in the end they really pick people because that's where all the leverage is. And I would just say to your colleagues, you know, it all starts with your people, and everything else good flows from that.
Well, thank you, Craig, for joining us, and thank you also for the tremendous support that Microsoft has given us in the preparation of Innovation Union, and indeed in all of the elements that we have set out there in Innovation Union that need to be pushed aside, the barriers and the obstacles that prevent companies from coming in and innovating, and companies, indigenous companies, being able to expand and develop and grow from being a small to a medium-sized to a large company. I'm thinking this evening, I have a 6-year-old granddaughter in the United States who's watching, and she thinks that it's perfectly normal that her grandmother should talk as an avatar. For me, it's an extraordinary experience. I know for everybody here, they probably think, you know, well, what does she think she's at? But thank you for giving me the opportunity and for showing what we can do on both sides of the Atlantic by virtue of Avatar Connect. Thank you,
Thanks.
Craig, very much for being here.
You did a great job running your avatar. I appreciate the invitation and the ability to participate, and it's fantastic for you to participate with me this way. I wish everybody a good evening and the end of the successful conference.
Thank you, Craig.
Bye-bye.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen,
nice.
that brings us to the closing address by Mr. Royal, who is chairing the Committee of the European Parliament looking after research, energy and industry. And as I mentioned before in my introduction, who is a very strong supporter of research and innovation, certainly in the current period of economic crisis, because Europe can only get out of the crisis through investing in the knowledge economy. So, Mr. Royal, the floor is yours. By the way, since Mr. Royal will give his address in German, I advise those who are not native German speakers or have difficulties understanding to put on their headphones because there's interpretation.